transphobia in our society is widespread, with trans people facing severe and pervasive discrimination, harassment, and social exclusion in many places around the world, such as the USA. Evidence seems to suggest that violence against trans people is increasing. Trans and non-binary people face many obstacles to social recognition of their desired genders, and also obstacles to access of to medical and other kind of specific support that they seek. Kind of as a result of a combination of these factors, there are extremely high rates of mental health issues, self-harm, attempted suicide, and so on amongst trans people. With all that kind of negative background, there have been moves in positive directions in many places in recent years, with general changes of opinions and kind of laws and provisions in a lot of places, and in the UK there was a kind of floated and consulted upon, but not passed into law, kind of amendments to the Gender Recognition Act. So I'm gonna now share my screen if I can. I've got some top quality slides for you all. So this is a graph. I think there's some. Can you all see that? Yeah. I mean, I think the kind of survey that this came from, it wasn't a large enough pool to necessarily, attach like a huge amount of significance to specific figures. But anyway, I thought this is quite a recent study. Thought this was kind of like interesting in what I was saying. In particular, like I thought the kind of age gradient would be steeper, and there's a kind of a bit of a kind of, well, the kind of young, it isn't entirely linear. The kind of statistics that they had associated with the same survey, but which aren't represented in here, maybe say a bit more in that 49% of people said that they think discrimination or prejudice against trans people is always wrong, which implies that 51% of people don't think that it's always wrong. So this is in the UK again, so about 62% of people disagree with the bottom statement. So these are this trend is showing kind of negative things. So I think I found that useful in terms of thinking about the kind of context that we're having this struggle in. But there are a lot of limitations of the survey, not only the size, but it doesn't tell you about the kind of vocalness of advocates of trans rights or opponents of trans rights in different age groups. And of course, I put this up not because I think that seeing things in terms of age is the most useful way of seeing it, but because that is often how people see it. So just briefly then, why trans rights? So fundamentally, as socialists, we support an expansion of freedom and a huge expansion of the possibilities of human flourishing. We stand up for bodily autonomy, and we oppose oppression and discrimination. And like these kind of basic progressive socialist values, are the kind of like starting point from which we support trans rights, or they are a starting point at least. However, there are significant forces, significant tendencies within the left, within the Labour movement, who oppose trans rights. So a lot of people might have seen. A lot of people might have seen this cartoon, which was published in the Morning Star, quite recently. It wasn't in isolation. So the Morning Star is the kind of only daily newspaper in the UK which claims to be socialist. It is, it has links with a lot of the kind of ruling cliques and upper layers of a lot of trade unions and the Labour Party in the country. So like, you know, it has a lot of influence and reflects a lot, you know, in many ways, many of the ideas of that kind of social layer. And this, you know, very transphobic cartoon is in no way a kind of exception to the rule. They printed various transphobic articles and so on. Another kind of important organisation to mention in the context of transphobia on the left and in the Labour movement is Women's Place UK. So this was an organisation set up in, as it says here, in 2017, and from, you know, the description that you can see here and their kind of summary, this is the first thing you get on their website. It's clear that, you know, as you can see from their history, but they don't make any attempt to hide that, you know, they were basically established to kind of push back against aims to, you know, marginally increase, well, you know, marginally but importantly increase, you know, trans rights in the specific area of the kind of Gender Recognition Act reforms. So Women's Place UK are relevant because them and the kind of political current around them, you know, have influence within various sections of the Labour movement. Haringey and another Labour Party branch recently passed motions that were, you know, originated from Women's Place UK. They've had influence in various other places. So why is this? Why were people on the left coming to such transphobic perspectives? So I think kind of you know, in one phrase, I'd say that it's a retreat from class politics. So, you know, we have in Workers' Liberty, we have a socialist feminist understanding of the world and of women's oppression, and, you know, from that, of the oppression of trans people and sexual minorities and so on. But with a kind of retreat from a class perspective and the defeat of the working class, you get you know, an increase of political perspectives which don't place class as central as that, which see, you know, a lot of people talk about radical, you know, transphobic radical feminists or trans exclusionary radical feminism. So radical feminism in its root is about saying that, you know, the fundamental dynamic and oppression in our society is a kind of trans historical, you know, always existing oppression of women by men, but kind of I think more fundamentally in terms of the retreat from class politics is the role of conspiracy theories and kind of conspiratorial thinking. You know, if you no longer believe that the kind of class dynamics and the complexities of class dynamics drives the world and how it changes, and that the working class can fight back, it's, you know, it's much easier to believe, you know, in conspiracy theories where, you know, a clique of, you know, the you know, the you know, clique of Rothschilds control the world or whatever. So like a lot of conspiracy theories obviously have anti-Semitic elements, but a lot of anti-trans thinking has conspiratorial elements. There's also kind of you know, general conservatism. So the Morning Star takes generally, you know, conservative you know, lines on a lot of issues, and kind of fueling both those things is Stalinism, and a kind of Stalinist, you know, within the Morning Star is a kind of, you know, a history of kind of Stalinist ideas and that kind of thing, and people might want to talk more about that. That's not the only factor behind conspiratorialism and kind of conservatism, but I think those are some of the key factors in why we see transphobia on the left. So then, kind of like how to fight it. So I think the first, the you know, our general perspective is that we fight bad ideas, bigoted ideas with open argument, criticism, and debate. So, you know, this isn't like we don't, you know, advocate as a general rule like shutting down of meetings in which people from Women's Place UK are talking of trying to get them banned from campuses or whatever. In general, we'd advocate, people go there and debate them, people leaflet outside them, proactively champion and argue the case for socialist, feminist, trans inclusive perspectives, beyond just places in which you come across transphobia on the left or on the right. But I think we need to kind of go beyond that in the sense that, the way we are going to not only get rid of transphobia, but like expand trans rights and improve society beyond that is fighting fighting through class struggle for a socialist feminist programme, a set of demands and a vision in which trans inclusion is central. So that's about fighting for more and for better for our class as a kind of united struggle for the interests of the working class, of women, of trans people, and so on, and through that undercutting like reactionary tendencies within the left and within the labour movement, and bring into that kind of trans exclusionary struggle, people who might otherwise be influenced by such reactionary perspectives. I think again, there's maybe an analogy that we can think about in terms of anti-Semitism, in that, in Workers' Liberty, we've done a lot of arguing against anti-Semitism on the left. But I think we think it's important not only to argue against that with, ideas and debating and publications and so on, but also to have, to champion. We think that anti-Semitism on the left is tied up, for example, in questions on Israel-Palestine, and the championing a two-state solution and kind of boldly advocating a like genuine progressive two-state solution, and the kind of politics that come with that is one way of helping the plight of the Palestinian people and the situation in the Middle East, but also fighting anti-Semitism within our movement. So that's the kind of that, and finally I'll just touch on kind of some of the specific things that we might want to talk about that we might want to raise in the in such a kind of socialist feminist program. So these 10, 11 different things here, so I'll quickly touch upon them, and then people might want to talk about them more in the discussion. So the first one is self-identification of going beyond what was proposed in the amendments to the Gender Recognition Act. I think we want self-identification where trans and non-binary people can change their legal gender through a declaration. And the kind of flip side of that is making institutions and the law gender neutral as far as possible. So that kind of thing also becomes less relevant. We want an expansion and more funding of gender identity services and trans healthcare, which have been proved by like copious evidence to be extremely beneficial on like a number of fronts, as well as facilitating people's kind of desires and facilitating their kind of freedom and flourishing, fighting. But these things, that the trans healthcare, that needs to be part of a fight for taking the NHS back into democratic public ownership, a huge expansion of funding to it, expansion of other aspects of the NHS. So stuff around like the kind of limitations, both legally and in terms of kind of provision and funding for stuff around sexual health services and stuff around reproductive rights. Tackling harassment, so the labour movement needs to take responsibility for tackling harassment and discrimination at work and in society beyond that, be it transphobia, sexism, racism, homophobia, etc., disability discrimination. Refuges, so domestic violence refuges have been hugely cut. This disproportionately affects women and disproportionately affects trans people. International solidarity, so trans people are oppressed even more than they are in the UK and many places around the world. Migrants' rights, LGBT people, trans people face a lot of obstacles through the UK border system. education. So, we argue and we fight for secular education, for an expanded progressive secular RSE relationship and sex education, but that should be kind of more expansive to kind of explore questions about gender identity and so on. And sex work, champion sex work rights kind of legally, and also supporting trade union and organizing initiatives within the sex work industry is vital. For trans people who are disproportionately work within that industry, and also women, of course. So prisons, one thing people often talk about, in this debate is women-only prisons and so on. I think we want to see prisons as they currently exist, abolished, and what remains of them completely reworked. And finally, a kind of a shorter working week as part of an expansion of various elements of a kind of a welfare state to undercut the driving forces behind a lot of the gender binary, which drives transphobia, sexism, discrimination against non-binary people and intersex people and so on. And there's also, obviously a demand that we'd want to champion for many other reasons, in terms of the kind of flourishing and of human freedom and the kind of fight for the betterment of our class. So I think I'll leave it there, and come back later. So a few different things. So I apologize. It sounds like the emphasis that came across from from what I said originally was not as intended when it comes to the different impressions that different trans people face, and particularly trans women. I agree with I guess what Kate was saying she disagrees with me on. I don't think I do disagree. I think trans women, both within the left and within society more widely, if you look at most statistics, violence or whatever, are disproportionately targeted. I think you can kind of analyze this in terms of the convergence of transphobia and misogyny, and often kind of combining to kind of go beyond and kind of a bit different from either of them. I think various of the things that I kind of put in the programme, expanded refuges, stuff for combating harassment, stuff around sex work, and kind of in a slightly different way, stuff around prisons, are things which would benefit a lot of women, a lot of trans people, and kind of in particular a lot of trans women. So on stats, I agree. The stats of that graph were not very good. I couldn't find any kind of better graphs. I think in terms of it's true that people aren't going to self-report, are less likely to self-report their own prejudice. Although interestingly, in that same survey they pointed out that people's willingness to admit racial prejudice is significantly higher than even now in the UK than against trans people. But I think what is more telling is what people say about other people. So people who have some kind of, people are quite likely to be like, well, yeah, I'm not transphobia, but I'm not transphobic, but other people, when they are, maybe it's not the most unreasonable thing, which I think you can see from the statistic that only 49% of people say that other people being transphobic or transphobic prejudice is always wrong. I think there are limitations to all these statistics. So something I've said elsewhere is international, I've forgotten who it was. I could dig it out if anyone wants. Contact me. So like international surveys about kind of attitudes towards well, all sorts of social attitudes, but have shown that consistently in every kind of global subcontinental region that people the answers that people give about, you know, it wasn't phrased in terms of trans people and LGBT people, but you know, people feel kind of more positive or less discriminatory against trans people than against you know, same-sex things. That's what people say in the surveys, but the kind of statistics in terms of discrimination, harassment, and violence, you know, paint a different story. And kind of what's going on behind that is that, like, well, there's a lot of things going on behind that. Like, a lot of transphobia is thought of, you know, in interviews with like people who've committed like transphobic violence. You know, a lot of what's kind of going on in their heads and maybe going on at some other social levels is thought of more in terms of, you know, things that we might think is to do with like homophobia and like threatening sexualities, things to do with like misogyny and so on, but it kind of, you know, comes out as transphobia. Yeah, kind of third point. So I just like to, I realised I didn't say something that I meant to say or should have said in kind of response to Roxy's question earlier. So I think one of the telling things about kind of women's place in that kind of rhetoric is people disagreeing with something when, like, they're disagreeing with something that isn't the case. So just as when, you know, people who are like, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, you know, says you can't criticize Israel. Like, people who go around shouting that, normally, like, that isn't at all the case of the IHRA definition, and normally it means that they actually have some sympathies towards the genuinely more anti-Semitic stuff. And likewise with this, there is nothing in the proposed GLA amendments to get rid of single-sex, women-only space and recognition of, like, discrimination against women. There's even provisions to allow exemptions for, you know, that if shelters, for example, wanted to, and I think most shelters have kind of said, well, we wouldn't want to do that anyway. You know, if they wanted to exclude trans women and have kind of a cis women only shelter, there are kind of provisions in exemptions to the Equality Act, which means that the GLA amendments wouldn't have even affected that. So, you know, whether that should be the case or not, you know, is a different question. But the fact that people are supposedly championing a cause which is kind of like false, I guess, you know, that says something, and that's they're kind of opening into more transphobia. And like Ed was saying, you know, people are championing that rather than talking about like more resources for all. Like, we want more. We want, like, you know, much more funding to go into kind of refuges. We shouldn't be talking about like how exactly we divide up prisons and so on. Like, we shouldn't. It shouldn't be okay that there are institutions in our society which are, you know, to the extent that prisons are like, you know, inculcators of like institutional abuse and violence and sexual abuse by guards and by inmates against each other. In terms of my second last point, yeah, in terms of kind of where next, I guess, kind of echoing some of what Kate was saying. I mean, you know, I'm not going to try and look into a crystal ball, but I think, like, what's important to recognize is that as with lots of things, there are contradictory tendencies here. So there are, in various ways, kind of growth of bits of transphobia here or there. There's also, you know, there's growth of you know, pro-trans politics. I think you can see that if you look at, you know, like, anecdotally, the kind of, you know, the kind of politics being raised on Pride or on, like, you know, various other things in recent years is one indicator that the fact that Labour leaders felt pressured to kind of respond in certain ways to demands around pledges recently, is another indicator. But I guess fundamentally, capitalism has contradictory tendencies as well as what we can observe in front of us. I think it's important, if we take a step back, it's beneficial, to some extent, equality between the exploited is beneficial to capitalism, in that, it, I'm not going to get into details of that, but, in terms of maximizing kind of flow and flexibility of labor, transphobic violence in general is not beneficial to capitalism. So that there are tendencies pulling in one direction. On the other hand, division within the working class can be beneficial to capitalism. I mean, I don't think you can reduce most of these things into trends just at the level of capitalism, but within the left you see contradictory trends as well, and I guess it's down to us to intervene to reconcile that in the direction that it should be. I guess kind of a final point to leave people with is that, all of what we've been talking about, and talking about the program, talking about the demands and so on, will be achieved, and we need to fight for it to be achieved through class struggle, through struggle in the workplace, in the Labour Party, and beyond that, and that through class struggle, and particularly through winning in class struggle, we can help to recenter class and recenter class politics, and do away with the kind of reactionary bollocks that we're having to fight. I think we can, looking at examples like lesbians and gay support, the miners, women against pit closures in both in the miners' strike, great upheavals, in the working class. There were really kind of liberatory moments for oppressed groups, and in terms of their repercussions, they were very significant. And on a smaller scale, in an individual workplace, fighting for some of the things I talked about, or even just improved conditions at work, can't, if you have any success, it can't do anything but help change to some extent the kind of balance of power at work and how people feel about that. And that's only going to help, that can play a vital part in helping people who are oppressed and discriminated in work, particularly for this current discussion, particularly trans people and trans women. Now that all said, of course, it isn't inevitable. We also need to pursue, the kind of ideological argument and battle. There were, if you look at the big industrial battles recently, a lot of them have been, for including the RMT union. I know, comrades here and elsewhere have had to also been fighting. So I'm talking about kind of class struggle in terms of strikes and so on. But I know comrades of ours within the RMT union have been fighting a lot of transphobia and reactionary politics within that. So in no sense is there an inevitability that class struggle leads to kind of progressive politics, but class struggle is also at the centre of how we fight for a better world.